had a conversation recently with my then 8-year-old son at the dinner table that really put in focus for me the challenges that we're facing right now in Canada. "Mommy," he said, "why does the government think you're a terrorist?" On the eve of the National Energy Board hearings here in British Columbia for the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline that's proposed to take oil sands or tar sands, bitumen, from the Alberta oil sands right through the Great Bear Rainforest to the coast here, our Minister of Natural Resources, some of you will remember, put a full-page ad in the Globe and Mail, an open letter to Canadians, with his concerns that radical groups were attempting to hijack regulatory systems to kill good projects. Those who opposed these pipelines were radical extremists. Honestly, after 20 years of doing this work, I was still naive enough to believe that our government would encourage public participation in public processes. Because whatever you think, whatever your opinion is of what our energy system should be and what our economy should be in Canada, we deserve to have the conversation. The letter was followed up by numerous speeches in the media by our Prime Minister and several ministers that were rigorously on message. The pipeline is in the national interest. Anyone who's opposed to it is an extremist. The next shoe to drop was, in fact, a debate in the Senate over whether the definition of domestic terrorism in Canada should be formally changed to include environmentalism. The examples used in the Senate debate were the work of Forest Ethics to encourage citizens to sign up for the Gateway hearings and engage in the process, an organization I co-founded, and the work of Greenpeace. At the time, I was Greenpeace International's climate director, thus the uncomfortable conversation with my 8-year-old. Since that time, the federal government has dramatically weakened our environmental laws. They have eliminated laws as old as Confederation. We've taken water protection out of the Navigable Waters Act. We've taken fisheries habitat protection out of the Fisheries Act. Why? Secret documents obtained by Post-Media News under Freedom of Information this year show that we eliminated these laws, thousands of changes in 2 large omnibus bills, because they were in the way of the oil industry. We eliminated these laws explicitly at the request of the oil industry. So why are we doing this? It's not about pipelines. It's about whether or not we decide to dramatically expand the oil sands at a pace and scale that even our government's own Privy Council warns will result in irreversible damage to our environment and our economy. But we don't hear those warnings as much anymore, because we used to hear them a lot from the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy. In fact, we had reports every year since 2006 saying, we can do this, Canada. We can build a low-carbon economy. We can reduce pollution. We can even have a stronger economy, but we need to slow down the oil sands. So what did our government do? They shut down the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy. And actually, a body created 16 years ago by Mulroney, a Tory body, they eliminated funding and shut it down. Similar to the Atmospheric Research Station, the Environmental Lakes Initiative, these are bodies that were warning us about the path that we're on. This year, they've been shut down. We've also seen the firing of hundreds of scientists from Environment Canada who have, and those who have stayed, are so closely monitored and restricted in what they can tell us, even though we fund that science as taxpayers, that the Journal of Nature recently noted it's time for the Canadian government to set its scientists free. If there's one thing that I've learned in the last year working on these issues, it's that oil corrodes. It's corroding our pipelines for sure, another spill today, but it's also corroding our institutions. ultimately the preconditions that are necessary for democracy to thrive, because democracy thrives when we have the information we need to decide good policy from bad policy. It thrives when we have transparency, when we have public engagement. Yet the public are being restricted, the information is being restricted, and the government is attacking charities who work on these issues. Despite all these big budget cuts I've talked about, the Canadian Revenue Agency got a bump of $8 million in their budget, and every single major environmental group I know of right now is under CRA audits that is taking their leadership away from scrutiny on these issues and to defending their charitable status. So this, despite the fact that the majority of Canadians are concerned about the impacts of the oil sands. The majority of Canadians, the polls show, want clean energy. We want to believe in climate change. Ooh, those were changing without me doing anything. That was very exciting. You know, remember climate change? Remember a couple of years ago when it was the front page of Time magazine, be worried, be very worried? Al Gore created the inconvenient truth, and our Prime Minister stood up in Copenhagen and said, climate change is the greatest challenge humanity has ever faced. Granted, 2 years ago when it wasn't as high, 2 years before that when it wasn't as high in the polls, he did refer to Kyoto as a socialist scheme to suck up money. But, all right, in 2009, it was there. We were all there. The majority of the world's leaders rushed to Copenhagen to address the issues. Obama stood up and announced that the nation that moved quickly away from fossil fuels was the nation that would lead the world. And then it went away. Except it didn't, of course. The United Nations says this year more people around the world will lose their homes as a result of climate change than war. We now know we are experiencing a 50% increase in the severity and frequency of violent storms around the world. Why? Of course, in large part because of the loss in sea ice that Michael was telling us about, because the Arctic is our global air conditioner, because we have simply allowed so much carbon to build up in the atmosphere that it is smothering the Earth and creating these weather patterns. The fact is, we can negotiate and debate it all we want in Canada, but the atmosphere doesn't negotiate. It can only hold so much carbon. So, yet, despite all this, at several international climate conventions, I've watched Canadian youth ripping the Canadian flags off their backpacks because they're too embarrassed to walk the halls of the international meetings and say they're Canadian. Why? Because the Canadian government has stalled, played way above its weight, stalling negotiations internationally. And refusing, of course, being the only developed country to pull out of Kyoto. Despite years of promises, we have no federal plan to address climate change. At several of those meetings, I met with international diplomats, people who had been diplomats for many years. One elderly man turned to me with tears in his eyes and he said, "What happened to Canada? I negotiated the Montreal Protocol with Canadians. So many different agreements, and Canada was a leader internationally. What's happened?" The hard truth is that lying under some of the most beautiful and intact forests in the world, lying under what we know is home to more freshwater and wetlands and lakes and rivers, our boreal forest, is Canada's oil sands, the single largest and most destructive project on Earth. I talk to people a lot about the oil sands internationally, and I frequently have people say to me, "It's a tragedy what's happening in Canada. This is unbelievable what's happening in Canada." It's not. A tragedy is a problem without a solution. A problem that has a solution that is not being acted upon is not a tragedy, it's a scandal. It's a scandal that we use the equivalent amount of gas in the oil sands every day that would heat 6 million Canadian homes. It's a scandal that Canada ranks 57th out of 60 countries in the Global Performing Climate Index because we have some of the weakest laws in the world. We did perform slightly better than Saudi Arabia. It's a scandal that we're spewing 300 million liters of toxic sludge into unlined open pits in the center of Canada that we know are leaking. It's a scandal that we have rare cancer clusters in First Nations communities downstream. That's a scandal, and we can fix it. Increasingly, I'm told that, what do you mean? You want to keep it in the ground? Come on, Canada could make a killing with this oil. We don't need to make a killing, Canada. We need to make a living. We need jobs that we know are safe. We need an economy that is clean, that our kids can be proud of. We need parents home with their kids instead of flying to Fort McMurray and their kids sitting at home waiting to see when they'll be home. So can we do it? Is it possible? Come on. We're the country that created the zipper. Of course we can. And in fact, it's already happening around the world. This is Andasol, Spain. This is a concentrated solar plant that is fueling 250,000 homes every day. In China, we hear a lot about the problems, but the fact is China is building a wind turbine every hour. Last year was the first year in human history that the new investment in solar, in wind, in renewables, globally, new electricity investment, exceeded the investment of oil, coal, and nuclear combined. We are living in such an exciting moment. We are truly living a tipping point moment where we can re-envision the world. We now have the technology to do this. We have the capacity in Canada. We have the creativity, and it will create more jobs, in fact, than the fossil fuel economy that we're currently pursuing. Here's the thing. It's not going to happen unless Canadians engage. We know that our governments react. Our governments react when they know that people care about these issues. Thousands of people are already starting to engage across the US, across British Columbia, across Canada, and that needs to happen. I think one of the most important things that I can leave with you is to remember that social change isn't linear. We have tipping point moments, just like with technology that we're experiencing on renewables. And that, in fact, so much change is possible in our lifetimes. Sometimes these issues can be huge and overwhelming, and I hear people saying, no, we can't fix it, it's too hard, it's too far from where we've come. I want to leave you with a story, as I started, from one of my family members, because when I came back from my first United Nations Climate Change Conference, I was so depressed I couldn't get out of my jammies. I spent a lot of time building Lego on the floor with my boys, and I spent some time with my 92-year-old grandmother. And she said to me, "Stop whining. You need to remember the scale of change that's possible in your lifetime. Because I've seen in my lifetime the entire world change, the way we communicate, the way we transport ourselves." She said, "When I was having your mother, we didn't have a phone, we had a party line. When it rang twice, it was for us. I didn't know that people, I didn't know anyone had ever been on a plane," she said. "We didn't have cell phones, we didn't have computers, let alone that raspberry you're always holding," she said to me, talking about my BlackBerry. She said, "In my lifetime, the world has become an entirely different place, and it will in yours." So I ask you, as Canada turns 150, let's build a world that our children can be proud of. Let's build a country again that leads. I want to be sitting with my grandchildren, and I want to be telling them about this crazy time in our history. Obviously where I got the title. This crazy time in our history when we clawed at the earth to get at the last of the oil. A crazy time in history when we used to fill our cars with gas. And they're not going to believe me because this country will be such a different place. Thank you.